The gunshot split the dawn air like thunder. Josephine Vasquez dropped to the ground behind the storage barrels outside the general store, her breath catching in her throat. 3 years since she'd left her old life behind, and still trouble seemed to find her like a bloodhound on a scent. It was 1878, and Eureka Springs, Arkansas, was supposed to be her sanctuary. The frontier town nestled in the Ozark Mountains had drawn people seeking healing from its supposedly miraculous waters, but Josephine had come seeking something else entirely: anonymity. "Get back here, you thieving rat." A man's voice bellowed from inside the general store, followed by another shot that splintered the wooden porch railing. Josephine kept low, inching toward the alley. She had nothing to do with whatever was happening, but experience had taught her that innocent bystanders often paid the highest price. Just as she reached the corner, a body collided with hers, sending them both tumbling into the dirt. "Sorry, madam," the man muttered, his voice deep and soft despite the urgency of the moment. He helped her up with a strong hand before quickly releasing her as if burned. Josephine found herself looking into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath a worn Stetson. Recognition flickered across his features. "Miss Vasquez," he acknowledged with a slight nod before stepping away, putting deliberate distance between them. "Apologies for the disturbance. Jacob Zachariah, the mysterious cowboy who'd arrived in Eureka Springs 2 months ago. The man who tipped his hat when they passed on the street but never initiated conversation. The man who somehow always appeared when trouble brewed, only to vanish once order was restored." "This isn't your fight," she said, brushing dust from her skirts. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Never said it was." Before she could respond, the storekeeper burst onto the porch, rifle in hand. "Zachariah, did you see which way that snake Portman went?" Jacob pointed west without hesitation. "Headed for the livery." The storekeeper rushed off, leaving them alone in the alley. Josephine noticed a canvas bag partially hidden behind Jacob's boot. "You're helping him escape," she stated flatly. Not a question. Jacob's expression remained neutral. "Portman didn't steal anything. Williams owed him wages for 3 weeks' work and refused to pay." "So you're judge and jury now?" "No, madam. Just someone who recognizes injustice when he sees it." Josephine knew she should walk away. Jacob Zachariah was exactly the sort of man she'd sworn to avoid: principled but dangerous, kind yet mysterious. Men like him left destruction in their wake, whether they intended to or not. "Next time, keep your heroics away from my shop." She owned the millinery store adjacent to the general store. "I can't afford bullet holes in my merchandise." Jacob retrieved the bag and nodded solemnly. "Won't happen again, Miss Vasquez." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Those flowers you planted last week, they're coming in real nice." Josephine stiffened. She'd planted wildflowers behind her shop, visible only from the back alley. How had he noticed? Why was he watching? "Thank you," she responded stiffly, not turning back. "Good day, Mr. Zachariah." She felt his eyes on her as she walked away, maintaining a composure that had become her armor. Inside her shop, she locked the door behind her and pressed her back against it, eyes closed. 3 years since Henry's betrayal. 3 years since she'd vowed never to trust a man again. 3 years of building walls around her heart. And now this cowboy with watchful eyes and a habit of appearing exactly when needed was threatening to make her question everything. But Josephine Vasquez knew better. She'd learned her lesson in blood and heartbreak. No matter how intriguing Jacob Zachariah might be, she would keep her distance. What she didn't know was that the stubborn cowboy had made a promise to himself the first day he saw her. He would watch over this fiercely independent woman with the haunted eyes, whether she wanted his protection or not. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers to Josephine's millinery shop. Ladies from town and visitors alike marveled at her creations, hats adorned with silk ribbons, delicate lace, and artificial flowers that rivaled nature's own. Her fingers moved deftly as she attached a spray of blue forget-me-nots to the brim of Mrs. Palmer's new Sunday hat. "Have you heard?" Mrs. Palmer asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say Jacob Zachariah isn't even his real name." Josephine maintained her concentration on the stitches. "I make it a point not to listen to gossip, Mrs. Palmer." The older woman continued undeterred. "Well, Gertrude Anderson's cousin works for the marshal in Fort Smith, and she says he was asking about a man matching Mr. Zachariah's description. Something about a shooting in Texas 2 years ago." Despite herself, Josephine's hands paused momentarily. She recovered quickly. "I'm sure half the men in these territories have some history they'd rather forget. Now, what do you think of the placement of these flowers?" Mrs. Palmer admired the hat with appropriate enthusiasm, but her eyes gleamed with the pleasure of someone who'd successfully planted a seed of curiosity. After the woman left, Josephine found herself at the window, gazing across the street toward the saloon where Jacob occasionally took his meals. A man with secrets. A man possibly on the run. All the more reason to maintain her distance. As evening approached, Josephine closed her shop and gathered her marketing basket. The late summer air hung heavy with humidity as she made her way to Harmon's grocery for her weekly supplies. She was selecting a can of peaches when a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the window, she saw 3 men on horseback, dusty from the trail and radiating menace. The kind of men who brought trouble wherever they went. They dismounted in front of the saloon across the street, their spurs jangling as their boots hit the dirt. "Those are the Conroy brothers," whispered Mr. Harmon from behind the counter. "Mean bunch from down Missouri way. Had some trouble with them last spring, broke up Wallace's place pretty bad over a card game." Josephine felt a chill despite the warm evening. "Perhaps I should finish my shopping tomorrow. Might be wise, Miss Vasquez." But as she stepped onto the boardwalk, basket in hand, she realized her timing couldn't have been worse. Jacob Zachariah was emerging from the saloon just as the Conroy brothers approached. The oldest brother stopped short, his hand instinctively moving toward his holstered gun. "Well, look what we have here," he drawled. "The ghost of Jacob Zachariah himself." Josephine froze, watching as Jacob casually leaned against the porch post, seemingly relaxed though she noted the subtle tension in his shoulders. "Evening, Frank," Jacob replied evenly. "Didn't expect to see you this far east." "Bet you didn't," the man called Frank replied. "Been tracking you since Wichita. That seems like a waste of good riding time." Frank's face darkened. "You know damn well why we're here. My brother Tom might never walk right again after what you did." Josephine should have turned away, should have sought safety, but she remained rooted to the spot. Jacob's eyes flicked briefly to her, a flash of concern crossing his features before his attention returned to the threat before him. "Your brother drew first, Frank. Ask anyone who was there." "Don't matter. Family's family." Frank's voice dropped dangerously. "And you're a dead man." Everything happened in a blur after that. Frank reached for his gun, but Jacob moved with startling speed. Instead of drawing his own weapon, he lunged forward, tackling Frank to the ground. The other 2 brothers moved to intervene, but several townsmen emerged from the saloon, some brandishing firearms. "That's enough." The authoritative voice belonged to Sheriff Davis, who approached with his deputy. "No trouble in my town, gentlemen." The confrontation dissolved into tense words and veiled threats, but no further violence erupted. Josephine realized she'd been holding her breath only when her lungs began to burn. As the sheriff escorted the Conroy brothers toward his office, Jacob's eyes met hers across the street. He didn't approach her, didn't call out, simply touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement before turning back into the saloon. Later that night, as Josephine prepared for bed in her small apartment above her shop, a soft knock at her back door startled her. Hand trembling, she reached for the small derringer she kept hidden in her sewing basket before approaching the door. "Who's there?" she called, voice steadier than she felt. "It's Jacob Zachariah, Miss Vasquez." His deep voice was unmistakable. "I'm not staying. Just wanted to make sure you got home safe after what happened in town." She hesitated, then spoke through the closed door. "I'm fine, Mr. Zachariah." "Good." A pause. "Those men, they'll be moving on tomorrow. Sheriff seeing to it. Were they telling the truth?" About what happened in Wichita, the silence stretched so long she thought he might have left. Finally, "Some of it, not all." "Are you running from the law, Mr. Zachariah?" "No, madam, just from mistakes." Josephine rested her forehead against the door. "Aren't we all?" "Get some rest, Miss Vasquez." His voice softened. "And maybe consider keeping that derringer closer to hand for a few days, just in case." She gasped softly. How had he known about her gun? "I watch people, Miss Vasquez. It's kept me alive this long." The sound of retreating footsteps told her he was leaving, but something compelled her to crack open the door. In the silver moonlight, she caught a glimpse of his broad shoulders as he disappeared into the shadows of the alley. Josephine secured the door again, troubled by the encounter and by her own reaction to it. The mysterious cowboy was dangerous not because she feared him, but because something about him made her want to lower her defenses. And that was something she'd sworn never to do again. Rain pattered against the windows the following morning, bringing a welcome break from the August heat. Josephine worked in her shop, designing a new display for the front window. The bell above the door jangled, and she turned to greet her customer only to find Ida Mee Johnson, the town's self-appointed gossip, shaking water from her umbrella. "Josephine, dear," Ida Mee exclaimed, "have you heard the news?" "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. What news would that be?" Josephine continued arranging hat forms, bracing herself for whatever tidbit Ida Mee deemed worthy of a special visit during a rainstorm. Jacob Zachariah saved little Timothy Brewer last night. The boy wandered off during the storm, and when they found him, he'd fallen into Crescent Creek. Mr. Zachariah pulled him out and carried him all the way to Dr. Mitchell's office. Josephine's hands stilled. "Is Timothy all right?" "Oh yes, just a bump on the head and a terrible chill. But if Mr. Zachariah hadn't been out checking his horse at the livery and heard the splash." Ida Mee shuddered dramatically. Providence must have sent that man to our town despite his questionable past. "I'm glad the boy is safe," Josephine said carefully. Ida Mee leaned closer. "They say he refused any reward from the Brewers, just tipped his hat and disappeared into the night." "So mysterious," her eyes gleamed. "And speaking of mysterious, I couldn't help but notice him leaving the alley behind your shop last night." Heat rushed to Josephine's cheeks. Mr. Zachariah was ensuring the Conroy brothers weren't lurking about after yesterday's confrontation. Nothing more. "Of course, dear." Ida Mee's tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "Well, I should continue my rounds. So much news to share on such a dreary day." After Ida Mee departed, Josephine found herself unable to focus on her work. Jacob Zachariah was becoming something of a local hero, a development that would only draw more attention to him, and by proximity to her. Attention was the last thing she wanted. By mid-afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets muddy but navigable. Josephine decided to visit Timothy Brewer's family with a small gift, a carved wooden train she'd purchased for her shop's display, but thought the boy might appreciate more. The Brewer home sat on the outskirts of town, a modest farmhouse surrounded by apple trees. Mrs. Brewer welcomed her warmly, accepting the gift with tearful thanks. "He's resting now," she explained, leading Josephine to the kitchen where she poured 2 cups of tea. "Dr. Mitchell says he'll be right as rain in a few days." "I'm so relieved," Josephine said sincerely. "It must have been terrifying." Mrs. Brewer nodded, her eyes distant. "If not for Mr. Zachariah, I don't even want to think about it. David, my husband, asked how we could repay him, but he wouldn't hear of it. Just said anyone would have done the same." She shook her head. "But they wouldn't have, would they? Not many would be out in that storm, and fewer still would have risked that creek in flood." Josephine sipped her tea, unsure how to respond. The Jacob Zachariah described by Mrs. Brewer matched the man who'd knocked on her door last night, considerate, protective, yet determined to remain in the shadows. As she was preparing to leave, Timothy's sleepy voice called from the bedroom. Mrs. Brewer excused herself to check on him, returning a moment later. "He's asking for you, Miss Vasquez. Says he has something important to tell you." Confused, Josephine followed her to the small bedroom where 8-year-old Timothy lay propped up on pillows, his forehead bandaged. "Miss Vasquez," he said earnestly when he saw her, "Mr. Zachariah said to give you a message if you came." Her heart stuttered. "He did?" Timothy nodded solemnly. "He said to tell you that he fixed your back fence where it was coming loose, and that you should check your woodpile because he thinks raccoons have been getting into it." Mrs. Brewer looked as puzzled as Josephine felt. "I'm sure that can wait until you're better, Timothy." "No, madam," the boy insisted. "He said it was important she know right away." And he lowered his voice conspiratorially. He said she shouldn't worry about the Conroys cause they left town at first light. Josephine thanked the boy, her mind racing. How had Jacob known she would visit Timothy? And why send such a mundane message about her fence and woodpile unless? She made her excuses and hurried back toward town. Instead of returning to her shop, she circled around to the back alley. Sure enough, the broken section of fence that enclosed her small yard had been mended with fresh lumber. But it was what she found at her woodpile that made her blood run cold. Tucked beneath a canvas tarp was a man's jacket, one she recognized as belonging to the youngest Conroy brother. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it to find a crude map of her shop and apartment, with notes on entry points and times. They had been planning to rob her or worse. Josephine sank onto a nearby stump, the paper clutched in her hand. Jacob hadn't just been watching out for her in a general sense. He'd actively prevented what could have been a tragedy. But how had he known? Had he confronted the Conroys, threatened them? And most importantly, why did he care so much about her safety while maintaining such careful distance? The questions swirled in her mind as she returned to her shop, the feeling of being both protected and observed settling uncomfortably over her. For the next week, Josephine didn't catch so much as a glimpse of Jacob Zachariah. It was as if he'd vanished from Eureka Springs entirely. She told herself this was for the best. The man clearly attracted trouble, and she had worked too hard for her peaceful existence to see it disrupted. Yet she found herself watching for him, her eyes drifting to the saloon across the street, to the livery where he boarded his horse, to the hiking trails above town where she'd occasionally spotted him in the early mornings. On Sunday, she attended church as usual, nodding politely to acquaintances as she took her seat in the back pew. Reverend Wallace's sermon focused on the Good Samaritan, the stranger who provided aid when others passed by. Josephine couldn't help but think of Jacob. After the service, as the congregation spilled onto the church lawn for social hour, Sheriff Davis approached her. "Miss Vasquez, might I have a word?" She followed him to a quiet corner beneath an oak tree, anxiety fluttering in her chest. "Is something wrong, Sheriff?" Davis rubbed his mustache thoughtfully. "Not wrong exactly, but I thought you should know I received a wire from Fort Smith yesterday. They're asking about Jacob Zachariah." Josephine kept her expression neutral. "I hardly know the man, Sheriff. I understand. But several people have mentioned seeing him near your shop. I wanted to be sure you weren't involved with whatever situation he's in." "I'm not," she stated firmly. "Mr. Zachariah has been nothing but a distant acquaintance." Davis nodded. "Good. Because while I've had no trouble from him personally, I'm getting the impression he's a man with complications following him." "What did the wire say exactly?" "Just asked if he was in town and requested I keep an eye on him. Didn't say he was wanted for anything specific." Davis shrugged. "But in my experience, when the federal marshal's office takes interest in a man, there's usually fire behind the smoke." After the sheriff left, Josephine made her excuses and departed, foregoing the usual Sunday social activities. Her mind was troubled as she walked the short distance to her home. If authorities were looking for Jacob, his problems were more serious than a feud with the Conroy brothers. She was so distracted that she nearly missed the small package on her back doorstep. Wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, it bore no name or note. Cautiously, she brought it inside and unwrapped it on her kitchen table. Inside was a book, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson, published just a few years earlier. Josephine ran her fingers over the embossed cover, confused. Opening it, she found a pressed wildflower marking a page. The poem it indicated was titled, "Distance is Not the Realm of Fox." Josephine read the lines, a strange emotion tightening her throat. "Distance is not the realm of fox, nor by relay of bird abated distance is until thyself, beloved." It could only be from Jacob. But how had he known of her love for poetry? She'd mentioned it to no one in town, having learned long ago that intellectual interests in women were often met with condescension. A memory surfaced months ago when she'd first opened her shop. She'd unpacked a crate of supplies and discovered her old volume of Wordsworth damaged by water. She'd stood in the alley, turning pages and lamenting the loss, believing herself alone. But Jacob Zachariah noticed things. Jacob Zachariah watched from a distance. The realization should have unsettled her, yet instead, she felt a dangerous warmth spreading through her chest. She closed the book firmly, reminding herself of the promise she'd made 3 years ago. No man would ever gain power over her heart again, not even a mysterious cowboy who sent poetry and mended fences. The following Tuesday brought disaster to Eureka Springs. A fire broke out in the feed store near midnight, and strong winds quickly spread it to neighboring businesses. Josephine awoke to shouting and the acrid smell of smoke. Grabbing her shawl, she rushed outside to find the entire street illuminated by the inferno just 2 buildings away from her shop. Men formed bucket lines from the nearby creek, while women helped evacuate families living in apartments above the affected stores. Sheriff Davis directed the efforts, his face blackened with soot. "Miss Vasquez," he called when he spotted her. "Your shop is in the path. You need to get your valuables out now." Heart pounding, Josephine rushed back inside. What could she save? Her sewing machine was too heavy to carry alone. The fabrics and trimmings represented most of her capital. The financial records in her desk were irreplaceable. She was frantically gathering ledgers when the front door burst open. Jacob Zachariah stood there, his shirt soaked with water, face streaked with ash. "You need to get out," he said without preamble. The milliners in Jefferson City burned like tinder when they had their fire last year. All the chemicals in the dyes. My work, she began. I'll help, but we have minutes, not hours. His tone brooked no argument. Together they worked quickly, Jacob carrying her sewing machine and heaviest supplies while Josephine filled a trunk with her most expensive materials and records. They had just gotten the last load to safety in the town square when a terrible cracking sound split the air. The roof of the neighboring hardware store collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris. Some landed on Josephine's shop roof, immediately catching the dry wooden shingles. No. She gasped, starting forward instinctively. Strong arms caught her. It's too late, Jacob said, holding her back. You got what matters. She watched in horror as flames engulfed the business she'd built from nothing. Years of work, independence, security, all disappearing before her eyes. Without thinking, she turned and pressed her face against Jacob's chest, a sob escaping her. His arms hesitated before carefully encircling her. I'm sorry, Josephine, he murmured, the first time he'd used her given name. By dawn, the fire had been contained, but 4 businesses lay in ruins, including Josephine's millinery shop. The townspeople gathered in the square, exhausted and smoke-stained, taking stock of the damage. Mayor Phillips addressed the crowd, promising aid for those affected and thanking those who had fought the blaze. And special gratitude to Mr. Zachariah, he added, who rushed into Watkins' place and saved their infant daughter when no one else could reach her. Josephine glanced around, but Jacob was nowhere to be seen. Sometime during the chaos of the morning, he had slipped away. You can stay with us, dear, offered Mrs. Mitchell, the doctor's wife. We have a spare room. Thank you, Josephine replied absently, her eyes still searching the crowd. She spent that day and the next in a fog of shock and grief. The Mitchells were kind hosts, but Josephine felt adrift. Without her shop, what place did she have in Eureka Springs? The small amount of savings she had wouldn't be enough to rebuild, especially with winter approaching. On the 3rd day after the fire, as she sifted through the salvaged items stored in the Mitchell's barn, Sheriff Davis paid her a visit. Miss Vasquez, I have something that might interest you. He held out a telegram. This came for you this morning. Confused, she took the paper and read the brief message. Opportunity to purchase inventory from retiring milliner in Little Rock. Stop full workshop equipment and materials. Stop deposit. Paid pending your inspection. Stop details with station master. Stop. I don't understand, she said, looking up at the sheriff. Who sent this? Davis shifted uncomfortably. That's the interesting part. The sender paid for the telegram in Little Rock, but according to my counterpart there, it was a man matching Jacob Zachariah's description. Josephine sat down heavily on a nearby crate. He's in Little Rock. Appears so. Left town the morning after the fire. The sheriff hesitated. Miss Vasquez, I should tell you I received another wire about him. Seems there's more to his story than just a dispute with the Conroys. What do you mean? 2 years ago, a man named Jacob Zachary was working as a hired gun for the railroad in Texas. There was an incident. A family refused to sell their land. Shots were fired. Davis looked uncomfortable. A woman was killed. Some say it was an accident. Others say the railroad men were sent to make an example. The blood drained from Josephine's face. And they think Jacob, our Jacob, was involved. The descriptions match. But here's the strange part. After that incident, this Jacob Zachary reportedly turned on his employers, testified against them to a grand jury, then disappeared when threats were made against his life. Davis shrugged. The railroad has powerful friends. Some say they've been hunting him ever since. Josephine's mind whirled with this new information. It explained so much why Jacob kept his distance from everyone, why he seemed to appear and disappear at will, why he avoided attention despite his good deeds. "You think he's dangerous, Sheriff?" Davis considered this. "To the railroad men." "Absolutely. To the people of this town." He shook his head. "That man pulled Sally Watkins' baby from a burning building. He saved Timothy Brewer from drowning. Whatever he may have done before, his actions here speak for themselves." After the sheriff left, Josephine sat alone in the barn, the telegram clutched in her hand. Jacob had put down a deposit on inventory that could restart her business. He'd left town perhaps to protect her from the complications of his own life. And now she had a decision to make. The logical choice was to ignore the telegram, to rebuild her life here in Eureka Springs with the support of people she knew. But another path beckoned, one that required her to take a risk, to trust, to follow a trail left by a man who had never asked for anything in return for his protection. By evening, her mind was made up. She would go to Little Rock, inspect the millinery inventory, and see if this opportunity was as promising as it seemed. She told herself it was purely a business decision. But as she packed her few remaining possessions the next morning, Josephine slipped the book of poetry into her bag, her fingers lingering on the pressed wildflower that marked his message to her. The journey to Little Rock took 2 days by stagecoach. Josephine arrived tired and dusty, checking into a modest hotel near the station before seeking out the station master as the telegram had instructed. "Ah, Miss Vasquez," the balding man said when she introduced herself. "Been expecting you. I have a letter and a package for you." The letter contained detailed instructions on finding Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield's millinery shop on Markham Street, along with a bank draft to cover Josephine's expenses in Little Rock. The package held a small leather pouch containing a key. "The gentleman who left these was most insistent that you receive them promptly upon your arrival," the station master said, studying her with open curiosity. "Friend of yours, is he?" "An acquaintance," Josephine replied carefully. The station master's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Must be some acquaintance, to put down $500 on a business site unseen." Josephine nearly dropped the letter. $500. That's what Mrs. Whitfield said, paid half her asking price as a deposit, with the rest contingent on your approval. He chuckled at her shocked expression. "Seems you've made quite an impression on that young man." Troubled and confused, Josephine made her way to the address provided. Whitfield's Millinery occupied a charming storefront with large display windows and an apartment above. Mrs. Whitfield herself was a dignified woman in her 60s whose arthritic hands had forced her retirement. "Your Mr. Zachariah was most persuasive," she said as she showed Josephine around the fully equipped workshop. "Said he represented a talented milliner whose establishment had been lost in a fire. Showed me one of your hat designs he'd apparently salvaged." "He had one of my hats?" Josephine asked, surprised. Mrs. Whitfield nodded. "A lovely blue creation with silk rosettes. Very fine work." Josephine remembered the hat. She designed it for the spring festival and had been particularly proud of the intricate flower work. She'd assumed it lost in the fire. The shop was everything the telegram had promised and more. Spacious, well-equipped, with a loyal customer base and excellent location. The apartment above was comfortably furnished, included in the sale price. It was, in every way, a perfect fresh start. "He said you'd want to examine everything thoroughly before committing," Mrs. Whitfield explained. "The key is for you to come and go as you please for the next week while you decide." That evening, alone in her hotel room, Josephine struggled with conflicting emotions. The opportunity was incredible, better than anything she could have rebuilt in Eureka Springs. But accepting meant being indebted to Jacob Zachariah, a man she barely knew, whose past contained violence and secrets. More troubling still was the realization that he must have taken that hat her design before the fire. Had he somehow anticipated the disaster? Or had he simply admired her work enough to purchase it earlier? And where was he now? The station master had mentioned Jacob left Little Rock 3 days ago, but gave no indication of his destination. Josephine spent the next day examining the millinery shop in detail, taking inventory and speaking with neighboring businesses. Everything confirmed her initial impression. This was a rare opportunity. By evening, she had made her decision. She would accept Mrs. Whitfield's offer, using her savings to cover the remaining amount of the purchase price. As she walked back to her hotel in the gathering twilight, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck made her turn. For a moment, she thought she glimpsed a familiar figure at the end of the street, broad-shouldered, wearing a Stetson. But when she looked again, no one was there. The next morning, she met with Mrs. Whitfield to finalize the sale. As they reviewed the paperwork, a question that had been bothering her finally surfaced. Mrs. Whitfield, the $500 deposit, was it paid in cash? The older woman shook her head. No, dear. Mr. Zachariah arranged a bank transfer, said it was from an account he maintained in St. Louis. This new information only deepened the mystery. A drifting cowboy with a violent past shouldn't have that kind of money, certainly not in a bank account states away. After concluding her business, Josephine decided to send a telegram to Sheriff Davis in Eureka Springs, informing him of her decision to relocate permanently to Little Rock. As she waited in the telegraph office, her attention was drawn to a newspaper left on a nearby bench. The headline made her blood freeze. Railroad detective killed in shootout. Hands trembling, she picked up the paper and read the article, which described how a Pinkerton agent employed by the Missouri Pacific Railroad had been found dead in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The agent had reportedly been tracking a witness who had testified against the railroad in a land dispute case 2 years earlier. Fort Smith was less than 100 miles from Eureka Springs. The pieces suddenly fell together in Josephine's mind. Jacob hadn't left merely to help her secure a new business. He had left because danger was closing in. Danger he'd been trying to keep away from her and the town. Without conscious thought, she found herself at the counter, sending a different telegram than she'd intended, this one to a U.S. Marshal she'd known in her previous life, before Eureka Springs. A man who owed her a favor and had connections throughout the territories. 2 days later, as Josephine was unpacking her belongings in the apartment above her new shop, a response arrived. Zachary case reopened. Stop new evidence exonerates him in woman's death. Stop railroad executives indicted for perjury and conspiracy. Stop marshals seeking him as witness not suspect. Stop will advise if located. Stop relief flooded through her, followed quickly by worry. Jacob didn't know he'd been exonerated. He was still running, still watching over his shoulder. And now, with a Pinkerton dead in Fort Smith, the danger to him was greater than ever. Josephine spent the next week establishing herself in Little Rock. She placed advertisements in the local paper, introduced herself to neighboring businesses, and began creating new designs to display in the shop windows. To all appearances, she was a businesswoman focused on her fresh start. But each evening, she found herself standing at her window, scanning the streets below for a familiar figure. Each morning, she checked with the station master for messages. None came. As September gave way to October, Josephine threw herself into preparations for the fall season. Her new designs drew favorable attention, and orders began to come in steadily. The success should have brought satisfaction, but a persistent emptiness haunted her. On a brisk October afternoon, as Josephine was closing her shop, the bell above the door jangled. She looked up to find a well-dressed woman in her 50s entering, her bearing aristocratic. "I do apologize for arriving at closing time," the woman said, "but I was told your millinery created the most exquisite hats in Little Rock." "You're not inconveniencing me at all," Josephine assured her, recognizing a potentially significant customer. "How may I help you?" The woman removed her gloves. "I require a special hat for my daughter's wedding next month, something elegant yet distinctive." As they discussed designs and materials, Josephine learned the woman was Mrs. Victoria Harrington, wife of a prominent banker and one of Little Rock's social leaders. Such a commission could establish Josephine's reputation among the city's elite. "Your designs show remarkable artistry, Mrs. Harrington commented, examining a half-finished creation. "Where did you train?" "I'm largely self-taught," Josephine admitted, "though I did apprentice briefly in Chicago." Mrs. Harrington's eyebrows rose. "Chicago, that explains your sophisticated aesthetic. We so rarely see such quality in these parts." She paused, studying Josephine with newfound interest. "You must join us for dinner this Saturday. My husband is hosting several business associates, and I'm in need of intelligent female company to balance the conversation." Before Josephine could formulate a polite refusal, the woman continued, "One of our guests will be particularly interested to meet you. John Blackwell, he's from Chicago originally, though he's been developing railroads throughout the territory for years." Josephine's hand stilled on the fabric she'd been showing. "Railroads?" "Yes, the Missouri Pacific Line. Such an ambitious man, widowed too." Mrs. Harrington's meaningful tone made her matchmaking intentions clear. "Very handsome for a man of his position." Fighting to keep her expression neutral, Josephine managed to thank Mrs. Harrington for the invitation while making a vague excuse about prior commitments. The woman left disappointed but not offended, promising to return for a fitting the following week. As soon as the door closed, Josephine sank into a chair, heart pounding. John Blackwell was a name she recognized from the newspaper articles about the railroad land disputes in Texas, one of the executives who had allegedly ordered the use of force against resistant landowners. One of the men who might still be hunting Jacob Zachariah. And now, by pure chance, their paths were about to cross in Little Rock. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Josephine quickly locked the shop and hurried upstairs to her apartment, mind racing with implications. If Blackwell was in Little Rock on railroad business, there was a chance he knew about the Pinkerton agent's death in Fort Smith. He might even know that Jacob had been seen in Arkansas. Worse, if Blackwell met her and learned she had recently come from Eureka Springs, he might make connections that could lead back to Jacob. Josephine paced her small sitting room, weighing her options. She could simply avoid the dinner and minimize contact with Mrs. Harrington. But doing so would mean sacrificing an important business opportunity and possibly arousing suspicion. Another option was to attend and carefully control what information she revealed about herself and her past. But that carried its own risks. Men like Blackwell were perceptive and ruthless. There was a third option, one that made her pulse quicken with both fear and determination. She could use the opportunity to gather information about Blackwell's activities and intentions, information that might help protect Jacob. The decision crystallized in her mind. 3 years ago, she had sworn never to risk her heart or her safety for a man again. But Jacob Zachariah had protected her repeatedly, asking nothing in return. He had given her a fresh start when she'd lost everything. Now she had a chance to repay that debt. It was not, she told herself firmly, because of any deeper feelings. It was simply a matter of justice and gratitude. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a crispness in the air that heralded the approach of winter. Josephine dressed with particular care in a deep burgundy gown that was fashionable without being ostentatious. She arranged her dark hair in a simple yet elegant style and selected a modest gold locket, her only remaining piece of jewelry from her life before Eureka Springs. The Harrington mansion stood on a hill overlooking the Arkansas River, its white columns gleaming in the early evening light. A servant showed her into a lavish parlor where half a dozen guests were already enjoying pre-dinner drinks. "Miss Vasquez, how delightful you could join us after all, Mrs. Harrington greeted her, leading her toward a cluster of guests. "Allow me to introduce you." Josephine smiled and nodded through several introductions. A judge and his wife, a cotton merchant from Memphis, a young state legislator. And this is Mr. John Blackwell of the Missouri Pacific Railroad. Blackwell was tall and distinguished, with silver threading his dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes were sharp as he took Josephine's offered hand, bowing slightly. "Miss Vasquez. Victoria tells me you're new to Little Rock." "Relatively so," Josephine replied, careful to keep her tone light. "I acquired Mrs. Whitfield's millinery business last month." "Ah, a businesswoman, how progressive." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "And before Little Rock?" Josephine had prepared for this question. "I traveled quite a bit after leaving Chicago. The territories offer so many opportunities for those willing to work hard." "Indeed they do." Blackwell's gaze was assessing. "Though I find many resist progress, clinging to outdated ways of life." "Progress means different things to different people, I suppose," she replied diplomatically. Dinner was announced before he could respond, and Josephine found herself seated between the judge and the young legislator, with Blackwell directly across from her. Throughout the meal, she felt his eyes returning to her periodically, a calculating expression on his face. The conversation flowed around various topics: politics in the capital, railroad expansion plans, social events of the coming season. Josephine participated just enough to appear engaged while carefully noting every mention of railroad business. "The Fort Smith line is proceeding ahead of schedule," Blackwell informed the table during the main course, "though we've had some security issues recently." "Ah, yes, I read about that unfortunate business with your detective," the judge commented. "Any progress in apprehending the culprit?" Blackwell's expression darkened momentarily. "We have strong leads. It's only a matter of time." His eyes flicked to Josephine as he spoke, and she forced herself to take a sip of wine, hiding any reaction. After dinner, the men withdrew for cigars while the women retired to the drawing room. Josephine used this opportunity to learn more about Blackwell from Mrs. Harrington, who was only too happy to discuss such an eligible bachelor. "He's been a widower for nearly 10 years, the older woman confided. "Completely devoted to his business since then. Some find him cold, but I think he's simply driven. His railroad work must take him all over the territories," Josephine observed. "Oh yes, constantly traveling. He only arrived in Little Rock 3 days ago and leaves for Fort Smith tomorrow. Something about ongoing investigations into company security." Mrs. Harrington lowered her voice. "Between us, I believe it involves that dreadful shooting. Such dangerous times we live in." When the men rejoined them, Blackwell made a point of engaging Josephine in conversation, his manner both charming and probing. He asked about her business, her impressions of Little Rock, her future plans. She answered carefully, revealing nothing of substance while maintaining a pleasant demeanor. As the evening drew to a close, Blackwell offered to escort her home. "Thank you, but I've arranged for a hired carriage," Josephine declined smoothly. "Perhaps another time then." His smile was confident. "I expect to return to Little Rock within the fortnight. I would be delighted to continue our conversation then." The implicit invitation hung in the air between them. Josephine inclined her head noncommittally before bidding the Harringtons good night. In the safety of her carriage, she finally allowed herself to tremble. Blackwell was heading to Fort Smith tomorrow, the very place where the Pinkerton had been killed. If he had strong leads, as he claimed, Jacob could be in imminent danger. But how could she warn him when she had no idea where he was? Back in her apartment, Josephine paced restlessly, weighing her limited options. She could send telegrams to every town within 100 miles, but that might create a paper trail that could be traced. She could travel to Fort Smith herself, but what would she do once there? As she stood by her window, gazing out at the quiet street below, a movement in the shadows across the way caught her attention. A tall figure stood beneath a lamppost, face obscured by a hat brim but stance achingly familiar. Josephine's heart leaped to her throat. Without conscious thought, she grabbed a shawl and rushed downstairs, unlocking the shop door with trembling fingers. The street was empty when she stepped outside. Had she imagined it? Was her concern for Jacob making her see phantoms? Then a low voice spoke from the alley beside her building. "You shouldn't be out this late, Miss Vasquez." She whirled to find Jacob standing in the shadows, his features barely visible in the darkness. He looked thinner than she remembered, more weathered, but his blue eyes still held that steady intensity. "Jacob," she breathed, "you're here, just passing through." His voice was careful, distant. "Wanted to make sure you were settling in all right. You've been watching the shop." He nodded slightly. "Shop looks good. You've done well with it. Thanks to you." She took a step toward him, noting how he tensed. "Jacob, I need to warn you. John Blackwell is in Little Rock." His entire demeanor changed, body coiling like a spring. "Blackwell, you're sure?" "I dined at his host's home tonight. He leaves for Fort Smith tomorrow. Something about investigating the death of his detective." Josephine moved closer, lowering her voice. "He said they have leads." Jacob's jaw tightened. "You spoke with him?" He was one of several guests. "I revealed nothing about Eureka Springs or you." She hesitated. "Jacob, I know about the Texas land dispute, about the woman who died." "How much do you know?" His voice had grown cold. "Enough to know you weren't responsible for her death." "The marshals have reopened the case. There's new evidence that exonerates you." She reached out impulsively, touching his arm. "They're looking for you as a witness now, not a suspect." He stared at her, disbelief warring with hope in his expression. "How do you know this?" "I contacted a marshal I once knew. He confirmed it." Jacob stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "Even if that's true, Blackwell and his kind don't care about legal exoneration. I testified against them, exposed their methods. That woman who died, she was pregnant. Her husband still blames me, and the railroad uses his vendetta to hunt me legally." The pieces of Jacob's complex past were finally falling into place. Not just a hired gun who'd had a change of heart, but a man who'd stood against powerful interests at great personal cost. "You can't stay in Arkansas," Josephine said urgently. "Not with Blackwell so close." "I know." His expression softened slightly. "I just needed to see that you were all right before I moved on." "Where will you go?" "Better you don't know." He glanced down the street, ever vigilant. "I should go. Being near me isn't safe for you." The thought of him disappearing again, perhaps forever this time, sent a wave of panic through Josephine. For 3 years, she'd guarded her heart against precisely this feeling, this vulnerability. Yet here it was, overwhelming her careful defenses. "Jacob," her voice caught, "the poetry book. Why?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Seemed like something you'd appreciate. You've been watching me since I arrived in Eureka Springs, haven't you? Not just recently." He looked away. "Made it my business to know everyone in town. Safer that way." Is that all it was? Safety, The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Jacob met her gaze directly. "No," he admitted quietly. "That's not all it was." Before she could respond, he stiffened, his attention caught by something down the street. "Someone's coming. Go inside, Josephine. Now. Jacob, please." The urgency in his voice brooked no argument. "I'll find a way to contact you when it's safe." With that promise hanging in the air, he melted back into the shadows of the alley. Moments later, a police constable rounded the corner on his nightly patrol, tipping his hat to Josephine as he passed. "Evening, madam. Everything all right?" "Yes," she replied automatically. "Just getting some air before bed." Once the constable had continued on his rounds, Josephine returned to her apartment, her mind whirling with the night's revelations. Jacob was alive. He had come to check on her, and despite his determination to keep his distance, he had admitted to feelings beyond mere protective instinct. But he was still in danger, perhaps now more than ever, with Blackwell so close, and she had no way of knowing when or if she would see him again. Sleep eluded her that night as she replayed their brief conversation. By morning, a decision had formed in her mind, one that went against every vow of self-preservation she'd made after Henry's betrayal. She would not simply wait for Jacob to contact her when it was safe. Such a time might never come. Instead, she would take action to help clear his name once and for all. The key lay with the evidence that had prompted the marshals to reopen the case, evidence she needed to learn more about. Over the next week, Josephine maintained her normal routine at the shop while making discreet inquiries. She sent another telegram to her marshal contact, requesting more specific information about the new evidence in Jacob's case. She also began subscribing to newspapers from Texas, scanning for any mentions of the reopened investigation. Meanwhile, she politely declined further invitations from Mrs. Harrington, citing the demands of her growing business. The risk of encountering Blackwell again was too great. 10 days after her nighttime encounter with Jacob, a response came from the marshal. New witness emerged. Stop railroad foreman confessed orders to fire on resisting families. Stop. Zachary attempted to prevent violence. Stop woman's death, attributed to executive-ordered actions. Stop documentation exists. Stop federal case building. Stop Josephine. Read the telegram 3 times. Hope building with each reading. There was concrete evidence of Jacob's innocence, evidence that could end his life as a fugitive. But the key phrase was documentation exists. What documentation? Where was it kept? And how could it be used to clear Jacob's name publicly before Blackwell or his agents found him? Her opportunity came from an unexpected source. 3 days later, while helping Mrs. Harrington with a final fitting for her daughter's wedding hat, Josephine learned that the banker was hosting a dinner for railroad investors the following week. "John Blackwell has returned from Fort Smith and will be presenting expansion plans," Mrs. Harrington explained proudly. "Such important business conducted right in our home. Harrison is beside himself with excitement." "How wonderful," Josephine murmured, pinning a delicate veil in place. "Will Mr. Blackwell be staying with you during his visit?" "Oh no, he keeps a suite at the Capitol Hotel. All his important papers and such are there. He's quite particular about his privacy." Mrs. Harrington lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between us, I believe he may be bringing proof of that troublemaker's guilt in the detective's death. Harrison says the railroad is preparing to announce a substantial reward for information." Josephine maintained her composure with effort. How efficient of them. That evening, she formulated a plan so audacious it frightened her. If Blackwell kept documentation at the hotel, there was a chance the evidence mentioned in the marshal's telegram might be among his papers. Evidence that could exonerate Jacob publicly, forcing the railroad to cease its pursuit. The risk was enormous. If caught searching Blackwell's rooms, she would likely face arrest or worse, if Blackwell realized her connection to Jacob. Yet the alternative, leaving Jacob to a life of constant flight or possible execution for a crime he didn't commit, was unthinkable. 2 days before the investors' dinner, Josephine closed her shop early and walked to the Capitol Hotel. The elegant establishment catered to Little Rock's most distinguished visitors, its marble-floored lobby bustling with well-dressed travelers and attentive staff. She approached the front desk with a confident smile. "Good afternoon. I'm delivering a special order for Mr. John Blackwell, a custom hat box for his niece's birthday. I was told he's expecting it." The clerk checked his register. "Mr. Blackwell is out at present, but I can have it sent up to his suite." "I'm afraid I need his signature on the delivery receipt," Josephine explained smoothly. "My employer is quite strict about documentation for custom orders. Perhaps I could wait for his return." "I'm not certain when he'll be back, miss." Josephine glanced at the clock on the wall. "I can wait half an hour. If he hasn't returned by then, I'll have to come back tomorrow." The clerk directed her to a comfortable seating area in the lobby, with a good view of both the front entrance and the grand staircase leading to the guest rooms. Josephine settled in with a small sewing kit she'd brought. Pretending to make minor adjustments to the ribbon on the hat box, she carried a prop she'd created specifically for this purpose. For 20 minutes, she observed the comings and goings in the lobby, noting the staff routines and security procedures. She was beginning to think she'd need to attempt a different approach when a commotion at the entrance caught her attention. John Blackwell strode into the lobby, accompanied by 2 other men in business attire. They were engaged in animated conversation, Blackwell gesturing emphatically as they moved toward the hotel restaurant. Josephine waited until they had disappeared through the restaurant doors before approaching the desk again. "I see Mr. Blackwell has returned, but he appears to be in a meeting," she said to the clerk. "Perhaps I could simply leave this in his room. I have the delivery details he can review later." The clerk hesitated, clearly torn between proper procedure and customer convenience. "It would save him the trouble of arranging another delivery time," Josephine added persuasively. "The hat box is rather large, as you can see." "Very well," the clerk relented. "Thomas will escort you." He summoned a young bellhop who took a key from a cabinet behind the desk. Josephine followed Thomas to the second floor, maintaining casual conversation about the unusually pleasant October weather. When they reached Blackwell's suite, the young man unlocked the door and stepped aside. "Where would you like to leave it, miss?" "Perhaps on the writing desk." Josephine entered the suite, taking in the opulent furnishings and, more importantly, the leather portfolio lying open on the desk. The bellhop hovered in the doorway. Josephine set down the hat box and turned to him with a warm smile. "Thank you for your assistance, Thomas." She pressed a coin into his palm, a generous tip. "I'll just leave the delivery receipt with the package." The young man glanced at the coin, nodded appreciatively, and stepped back into the hallway. "Will there be anything else, miss?" "No, thank you. I can find my way back to the lobby." As soon as he left, Josephine moved quickly to the desk. The portfolio contained various documents related to railroad business financial projections, land acquisition plans, correspondence with investors. She rifled through them carefully, conscious that Blackwell could return at any moment. Near the bottom of the stack, she found what she was looking for, a folder labeled Zachary Investigation. Inside were telegrams, reports from Pinkerton agents, and most damning of all, a letter on Missouri Pacific letterhead dated 2 years earlier, instructing regional managers to take all necessary measures against holdout landowners, with specific mention of making examples where required. The letter was signed by Blackwell himself. Also in the folder was a sworn affidavit from a foreman named Ellis, confirming that he had been ordered to intimidate by any means necessary, and that Jacob Zachariah had attempted to prevent violence when the confrontation escalated. Josephine's hands trembled as she quickly untied the ribbon on her hat box. Inside was not a hat, but a small camera she'd borrowed from a photographer friend, promising to document a client's wedding preparations. With shaking fingers, she set up the camera and photographed each incriminating document, working as quickly as she dared. She had just replaced the documents and was returning the camera to her hat box when voices in the hallway made her freeze. Blackwell was returning to his suite, and he wasn't alone. Josephine looked around frantically. The main door was impossible they would see her immediately. A door to the adjoining bedroom stood partially open. She slipped through it silently, pulling it nearly closed behind her just as the suite's main door opened. "Still maintain we should offer a larger reward," an unfamiliar voice was saying. "Zachariah has eluded us for too long." "Patience, George." Blackwell's voice was coldly confident. "Our man in Fort Smith believes Zachariah is still in the area. The woman is the key. The milliner. You're certain there's a connection. She arrived in Little Rock too soon after the Eureka Springs fire to be coincidence. And my sources confirm she received a substantial bank transfer from an account we've been monitoring." Josephine's blood ran cold. Blackwell had been investigating her all along. "You think she knows where he is now?" the second man asked. "Perhaps not. But I believe she knows how to contact him, or he her." Blackwell's voice took on a calculating tone. "Which is why I've arranged for her shop to be watched. When Zachariah appears, and he will be waiting." Josephine pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She was leading Blackwell straight to Jacob. The men continued discussing strategy, unaware of her presence in the next room. Through the narrow opening in the door, she could see Blackwell moving papers on his desk, pausing briefly at the portfolio she'd just replaced. "Someone's been here," he said suddenly, his voice sharp. "What do you mean?" his companion asked. "These papers are out of order." Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. "And what's this?" He had noticed the hat box. Josephine's mind raced. There was only one way out of this situation. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the bedroom door open and stepped into the main room, summoning every ounce of composure she possessed. "Mr. Blackwell, please accept my apologies for the intrusion." She smiled as if merely embarrassed rather than terrified. "The desk clerk said I could wait in your suite to deliver this custom order." Blackwell's eyes bored into her, suspicion evident in his rigid posture. "Miss Vasquez, what an unexpected pleasure." "I should have left it with the clerk, but Mrs. Harrington was most insistent that you receive it personally." She gestured to the hat box. "A token of appreciation for your participation in the investors' dinner. She commissioned it specially." "Did she indeed?" Blackwell's tone made it clear he didn't believe her. "How thoughtful, though I don't recall mentioning the dinner to Victoria. I believe Mr. Harrington told her of your role in the proceedings." Josephine maintained her pleasant expression through sheer force of will. "I should be going. I've left my shop unattended too long already." She moved toward the door, but Blackwell stepped into her path. "You seem in quite a hurry, Miss Vasquez." His voice had dropped to a dangerous softness. "Perhaps you'd care to explain what you were really doing in my rooms." "I've explained my purpose, Mr. Blackwell." She met his gaze steadily despite her pounding heart. "If you don't wish to accept Mrs. Harrington's gift, I'll certainly inform her." Blackwell studied her for a long moment. Then, without warning, he reached for the hat box. "Let's see this custom creation, shall we?" Josephine's stomach dropped as he opened the box, revealing not a hat but the camera nestled inside. "How curious," Blackwell said, his voice like ice. "I wasn't aware that millinery required photographic equipment." "Mr. Blackwell, search her," he ordered his companion. The second man moved toward Josephine, but she was faster. She shoved the hat box into Blackwell's chest and bolted for the door. She had nearly reached it when Blackwell's hand closed around her arm, his grip bruising. "You've made a serious mistake, Miss Vasquez," he hissed. "Whatever your relationship with Zachariah, it will cost you dearly." "I don't know what you're talking about," she insisted, struggling against his hold. A commotion in the hallway interrupted them raised voices, running feet, and then a thunderous knock on the suite door. "U.S. Marshal, open up!" The door burst open before anyone could respond. Two men with badges and drawn revolvers entered, followed by a face Josephine recognized with overwhelming relief: Marshal Daniel Hawkins, her former acquaintance, and the man she'd contacted about Jacob's case. "John Blackwell," Hawkins announced formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and suspicion of ordering the murder of Elena Mendez in the Texas Territory 2 years ago." Blackwell's face contorted with rage. "This is absurd. I am a respected businessman, a businessman with a lot of explaining to do." Hawkins nodded to his deputies, who moved to restrain Blackwell and his companion. "We have sworn testimony from 3 of your former employees, including Ellis, who's turned state's evidence." As one deputy secured Blackwell with handcuffs, the other retrieved the portfolio from the desk. Hawkins turned to Josephine with a questioning look. "You all right, Miss Vasquez?" she nodded, rubbing her arm where Blackwell's grip had left marks. "How did you know to come here?" "Got your telegram asking for details on the Zachary case. When I heard rumors that Blackwell was in Little Rock, I figured I'd deliver the information personally." He gave her a knowing look. "Didn't expect to find you in the thick of things, though." "She was spying," Blackwell spat. "Photographing private documents." Hawkins raised an eyebrow at Josephine. "That true?" She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I was gathering evidence to help clear Jacob Zachary's name." "Well, you can rest easy on that account. Federal prosecutors already filed papers establishing Zachary's innocence." Hawkins gestured to the camera in the hat box. "Though I'd be obliged if you'd share whatever you found. Might strengthen our case against these railroad boys." As Blackwell and his associate were led away, Hawkins remained behind with Josephine. "You took quite a risk," he said, his expression a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "Blackwell's a dangerous man." "Jacob Zachariah saved my life and my livelihood," she replied simply. "I owed him this much." Hawkins studied her for a long moment. "It's more than that, isn't it?" Josephine didn't answer directly. "Do you know where he is? Jacob, I mean." "No, but word of Blackwell's arrest will spread fast. If Zachariah, or Zachary, I should say, has any sense, he'll come out of hiding once he hears the railroad's case against him has collapsed." Hawkins paused. "Unless he has other reasons to keep running." "What other reasons would he have?" "That's something only he can answer." The marshal tipped his hat. "Take care, Miss Vasquez. If you hear from him, let him know he's a free man now." After Hawkins left, Josephine returned to her shop in a daze, emotions swirling between triumph and uncertainty. Jacob was exonerated. The man who had hunted him was in custody. Justice had prevailed. But would it matter? Would Jacob return now that it was safe? Or had he moved on, continuing his solitary existence out of habit or lingering fear? Days passed with no word. Josephine reopened her shop, threw herself into preparing for the upcoming holiday season, and tried not to watch the street for a familiar figure. Each night, she stood at her window, scanning the shadows, hoping yet preparing herself for disappointment. A week after Blackwell's arrest, Josephine was working late, finalizing a complex design for a Christmas display. The shop below was dark, the streets quiet as a gentle snow the first of the season began to fall. The soft knock at her apartment door was so faint she almost missed it. Wondering who would call at such a late hour, she approached cautiously. "Who is it?" she called. "Jacob." The single word sent her heart racing. She opened the door to find him standing there, snowflakes melting in his dark hair, his blue eyes searching her face. "I heard about Blackwell," he said quietly. "Marshal Hawkins found me outside Fort Smith, told me everything." He paused, emotion flickering across his features. "He said you were there when they arrested him, that you were gathering evidence." Josephine stepped back, inviting him in. "I couldn't let you keep running when I knew there was proof of your innocence." Jacob entered hesitantly, removing his hat, looking somehow out of place in her cozy apartment. "You could have been killed, Josephine." "So could you, 12 times over since I've known you." She met his gaze directly. "Yet you kept watching over me, helping me, protecting me even from a distance." "That was different." "Was it?" She moved closer to him. "Why did you help me, Jacob? Why the shop in Little Rock, the poetry book, all of it?" He looked away, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. "I recognized something in you the first day you arrived in Eureka Springs, a wariness, a determination to stand alone." His voice softened. "I understood it because I felt the same way." "We're quite a pair," she said with a slight smile, "both so determined to keep our distance." "I had my reasons," he reminded her. "I was a hunted man, and now. He took a deep breath. "Now I'm not sure what I am, a free man according to Hawkins. But after 2 years of looking over my shoulder, I don't know if I remember how to live any other way." Josephine took another step toward him, close enough now to feel the warmth radiating from him. "Perhaps it's something you could relearn, with help." Jacob's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Why would you help me after everything? I brought danger to your door. I watched you from shadows like some specter." "Because despite all my determination to never trust a man again after Henry's betrayal, I found myself trusting you, a man I barely knew." She reached up, her fingers hovering near his face without quite touching. "Because you proved again and again that not all men bring destruction in their wake." He captured her hand in his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. "I'm not a perfect man, Josephine. I've done things I regret. I'm not asking for perfection." She smiled softly. "Just honesty. And perhaps proximity rather than distance." Something in Jacob's expression shifted, the careful reserve giving way to vulnerability and hope. "I don't know how to court a lady properly. I've been running too long." "Then stop running," she whispered. "Stay." The word hung between them, a question and an invitation. Jacob's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch reverent. "If I stay," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "it won't be just for a while. You should know that." "Good," Josephine replied, leaning into his touch. "Because I have no intention of letting you disappear again, Jacob Zachariah." His smile, the first full, genuine smile she'd seen from him, transformed his face. "It's actually Jacob Zachary," he corrected gently, "though I've grown accustomed to Zachariah." "I think I prefer Zachary," she decided. "It suits you better. Does it now?" There was a warmth in his tone she'd never heard before. "Yes, and I look forward to becoming better acquainted with the real Jacob Zachary." His response was to lower his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Josephine had spent 3 years keeping men at a distance, and now that she'd chosen to let this one close, she had no intention of hesitating. She rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his, sealing a connection that had been forming since the day they'd collided in an alley in Eureka Springs. His arms encircled her, strong yet gentle, as the kiss deepened into a promise of the future neither had dared to imagine. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, snow continued to fall outside her window, covering Little Rock in a blanket of white that symbolized the fresh start they had both been seeking. "Stay for breakfast?" she asked, her arms still around his neck. Jacob's answering smile was all the confirmation she needed. Spring came early to Little Rock in 1879, bringing with it new beginnings. Josephine's millinery business flourished, her designs becoming sought after throughout Arkansas and beyond. Jacob, using his restored name of Zachary, had established himself as a respected horse trainer. His natural affinity with the animals and reputation for fairness earning him a steady clientele. They were married in April, a small ceremony in the garden behind their new home, a modest but charming house on the outskirts of town with enough land for Jacob's horses and Josephine's wildflowers. Marshall Hawkins attended, along with Mrs. Whitfield and a handful of friends from both Eureka Springs and Little Rock. As sunset painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Jacob and Josephine stood on their porch, his arm around her waist as they watched their guests depart. "Happy, Mrs. Zachary?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied honestly, "though I'm still getting used to the name. I'm still getting used to not looking over my shoulder every 5 minutes," he admitted with a soft laugh. "Old habits." Josephine turned in his embrace to face him. "We've both had to unlearn some habits. I never thought I'd trust anyone enough to share my life again. And I never thought I'd stop running long enough to build one." Jacob's blue eyes, once so guarded, now gazed at her with open adoration. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stay. Thank you for watching over me all those months, even from a distance." She smiled mischievously. "Though I still want to know how you managed to notice so many details about my life without being seen." Jacob's laugh was warm and relaxed, a sound that had become wonderfully familiar over the past months. "A man has to keep some mysteries, doesn't he? I suppose I can allow you that one." She rose on tiptoe to kiss him, still marveling at the freedom to do so whenever she wished. "As long as you promise no more disappearing acts." "Never again," he vowed, tightening his arms around her. "Though I might occasionally need to ride out to Fort Smith or St. Louis on business." "Business that occasionally coincides with Marshall Hawkins' investigations into remaining railroad corruption?" she asked knowingly. Jacob had the grace to look slightly abashed. "The Marshal values an experienced pair of eyes now and then." "Just be careful," Josephine said, her tone light but her eyes serious. "I've grown rather attached to having you around, Mr. Zachary." "As I have to being around, Mrs. Zachary." He kissed her again, slowly and thoroughly, until they were both breathless. "I believe I mentioned something about carrying you over the threshold." Josephine laughed as he swept her into his arms. "I believe you did." As Jacob carried her into their home, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought them here from two wounded souls determined to maintain their isolation to partners who had found strength in vulnerability, security in trust. The walls she had built around her heart after Henry's betrayal had not simply been broken down. They had been replaced by something stronger, a love freely given and received, with eyes wide open to both past and future. Jacob set her down in their bedroom, his hands gentle as he traced the curve of her cheek. "I love you, Josephine," he said, the words still new enough to carry a touch of wonder. "More than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she replied, the declaration no longer frightening but liberating. "Enough to track you across half of Arkansas." His smile was her reward, and the knowledge that the distance between them, once maintained by mutual caution, had been replaced by a closeness neither had dared to hope for. Outside their window, spring flowers bloomed in the garden where they would build their future, no longer alone, no longer afraid, and never again apart. 3 years later, in the summer of 1882, Josephine sat on a blanket beneath the large oak tree in their garden, watching as Jacob taught their 18-month-old son, Daniel, to pat the nose of a gentle mare. The boy's delighted giggles filled the air as the horse nuzzled his small hand. "Gentle Danny," Jacob instructed, his deep voice patient. "That's the way." Josephine smiled at the tableau they presented, her husband's protective hand steadying their son, whose dark curls and blue eyes were a perfect blend of them both. In the 3 years since their wedding, Jacob had embraced fatherhood with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything important in his life. His business had expanded to include not just training but breeding quality horses, establishing the Zachary name as synonymous with excellence throughout the region. Josephine's millinery shop had grown as well, now employing 3 assistants while allowing her the flexibility to balance work with motherhood. "I think we have a future horseman here," Jacob called to her, pride evident in his voice as Daniel fearlessly patted the mare's velvety muzzle. "Just like his father," Josephine agreed, gathering the remains of their picnic lunch. "Though I'm still hoping he'll show some interest in design as well." Jacob lifted their son onto his shoulders, making the boy shriek with delight. "Maybe we'll have both a horseman and a designer." "Perhaps we will," Josephine replied with a secretive smile, her hand drifting to her still flat stomach. She hadn't told Jacob yet about the new life growing inside her, wanting to choose the perfect moment for such news. As if reading her thoughts, something he'd grown uncannily good at doing, Jacob's gaze sharpened, studying her with the attentiveness that had once unnerved her, but now simply made her feel cherished. "You're looking particularly beautiful today," he commented, setting Daniel down on the blanket with a wooden horse to play with. "Something about you seems different." Josephine laughed. "Still watching me so carefully, Mr. Zachary, always." He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "It's become one of my favorite pastimes." She leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing through her. "Do you ever think about how far we've come? From that day in Eureka Springs when we literally collided in an alley." "Often." Jacob's voice softened with reminiscence. "You were so determined to keep me at arm's length." "And you were equally determined to keep watch from a distance," she countered. "We were quite the pair." "Were?" He raised an eyebrow teasingly. "I'd say we still are, just with less running and hiding involved." Josephine laughed, then grew more serious. "Do you ever regret it? Stopping the running, I mean. Settling down with me and Danny?" Jacob turned to face her fully, his expression solemn. "Not for a single moment. You and Danny, you're everything I never knew I needed." He touched her cheek gently. "What about you? Do you ever miss your independent life before a mysterious cowboy complicated everything?" "Never," she answered without hesitation. "Though I maintain it was you who complicated matters with all your heroics and fence-mending and poetry books." His smile was warm with memory. "That book. I wasn't sure you'd understand what I was trying to say with it. That distance isn't truly distance when hearts are involved." Josephine squeezed his hand. "I understood perfectly, though it took me far too long to accept it." Daniel toddled over to them, babbling happily and offering his wooden horse to Jacob, who accepted it with appropriate solemnity. As their son climbed into Josephine's lap, she decided this moment was perfect after all. "Jacob," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." His eyes met hers, already filled with understanding. "Is it what I think it is?" She nodded, her free hand moving to her stomach. "In the winter, Dr. Mitchell confirmed it yesterday. Jacob's face transformed with joy, his hand covering hers. Another miracle. Are you happy? She asked, though his expression had already answered. Beyond words. He leaned forward to kiss her, gentle and reverent. Thank you. For what? For everything. For taking a chance on a man who kept his distance. For building this life with me. His voice grew husky with emotion. For this family. As the afternoon sun filtered through the oak leaves, casting dappled shadows across their small family tableau, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From two wounded souls determined to protect themselves from further pain, they had found healing in each other, not despite their caution, but because of the care they'd taken in building trust. Jacob Zachariah still watched over those he loved with vigilant attention. Josephine Vasquez Zachariah still valued her independence and strength. But the walls they'd built to keep others out had transformed into boundaries that defined the sacred space of their family, protecting rather than isolating. What are you thinking about? Jacob asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Josephine smiled, cradling their son while her husband's hand remained protectively over their unborn child. I'm thinking that some distances are meant to be crossed after all. And some people are meant to find each other, Jacob added, no matter how hard they try to avoid it. In the years that followed, their family grew and flourished. A daughter joined them the following winter, Rebecca, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet determination. 2 years later, twins William and Joseph completed their family, bringing joyful chaos to the Zachariah household. Jacob's reputation as a horseman spread throughout the territories, while Josephine's designs were featured in magazines as far away as New York. They faced challenges together: economic downturns, Jacob's occasional nightmares from his past, Josephine's struggles to balance her growing business with motherhood, but they faced them united. The distance that had once defined their relationship replaced by an unshakable closeness. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Jacob would recite poetry to Josephine on their porch swing, his voice low and intimate as he reminded her of the words that had once bridged the careful space between them. Distance is not the realm of fox, nor by relay of bird abated distance is until thyself, beloved. Distance, they had learned, was not measured in feet or miles, but in the courage to trust, to risk, to love. In finding each other, the woman who'd vowed never to let a man close again, and the cowboy who'd kept his distance, but never really left, they had discovered that the greatest journey was not across physical space, but across the terrain of the heart. And it was a journey worth every step.